Thank you all for coming. My name is Bill Dwight. I am the president, just simply because I drew the short straw of Northampton Community Television. Northampton Community Television, we're actually more of an egalitarian group, but we are the nonprofit group that came as a condition of contract with Comcast. I don't know if any of you remember, but I'll give you a brief history. Comcast actually used to manage the studios here in the city of Northampton. They provided the facilities and the training, such as it was for some time. At one point, under the aegis of Jim McKeever, who's here today, who was a member of the advisory board, it flourished. Then it slowly dwindled down with lack of resources and funds and timing. The contract renewal came up, and there was lots of frustration in the community because there wasn't enough access to access. Irony indeed, but now we have this system where we've, and through the help and work and effort of a lot of people in the community, the list is too long to acknowledge, and maybe we'll do a crawl on the end of this program to show you who we can thank. I'd like to point out there are a few people here that are of particular interest. We did mention that there's a number of counselors here, and it's all nice to note the hoity-toity types, but there's the more important here is we have citizens engaged, citizens who have done producing, citizens who are also committed to learning how to produce and create their own programming. We also have here Jim Lesko, who's from Amherst Community Television. He's the brand new executive director there. And he is, one of the things that Jim McKeever once described was a vision of trying to create a valley-wide system of communication and a valley-wide television network, if you will. We're working with Jim with that. We're working all up and down the valley in Long Meadow and Springfield, and we're not just isolated fiefdoms of media. We have enormous resources here in the valley that have been, in some cases, frustrated, in some cases have not been recognized yet or undiscovered. So it is my hope and and my passion that this happen. Northampton has experienced recently conversations about issues of transparency. Now, the issue of transparency comes from the fact that there's not much visibility. It's not due to the fact that I personally believe it's not because anything is being hidden, it's because it's hard to discover and see. It's been very frustrating for a lot of people. Now we have the means to program and project planning board hearings, other hearings. Some might induce coma, that's possible, but the others might actually reveal some of the process and some of the citizen engagement, and I think might reduce and temper some of the antipathies that have evolved as a result of some of the lack of means to project these systems. We got that here. I also want to, before I go on, I want to acknowledge the passing of Jeff Zomek, who served this community as he was the poor guy who suffered with the lack of dwindling resources. He was the guy who was left with the angry customer base, and he handled it very well. He was a gentle and kind soul, and he died recently, and we will miss him. And we can't proceed through any of this without acknowledging the value that he had to Northampton and the fact that we'll miss him. I'm going to introduce Sut Jhally. Sut Jhally is the founder of Media Education Foundation. He's the founder, he's the heart and soul of Media Education Foundation. MEF is based here. I'm also on the board there, just so in the interest of full disclosure. But that's how I got him to come here. But Media Education Foundation is a global, there's a global expanse. We provide films and videos that deconstruct and demystify media and show and pull back the curtain and reveal behind the curtain how you are being manipulated in the process, how we are being manipulated in the process, and how our voices have been taken away from us. Sut Jhally, there's not a more eloquent advocate for restoring the voices of the people or empowering people through the value of media, and also, in order to do that, you have to understand media. So please welcome Sut Jhally.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you, Bill. I'm actually delighted to be here at the opening kickoff for NCTV. Actually, I'm one of the few people, the city council meetings that are televised on cable access, I think are really compelling. sometimes find myself, I'll watch 5 minutes of it, and then next thing I know, it's like, 4 hours later, or wherever it is. But that is kind of democracy in action. And what I'd like to do today is I'd like to kind of frame the significance of an institute, of an organization like NCTV, and in kind of philosophical terms. The ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius was once asked what he would do if he were ever to lead the state. Someone said, okay, you're in charge of the state, what would you do? And he replied, he would, quote, rectify the language. In fact, if he was asked that today, he'd say he would control the media. Because he realized that if you can control the stories that are told, if you can control the language through which people speak, and the categories of thought, you can actually control people in their imaginations. You can control people in their heads. You don't need police on street corners. You don't need soldiers on street corners to maintain power. You can in fact control people, as I said, in their own imaginations. It was in recognition of that, so that's the power of storytelling. That's the power of what we can call culture. That in fact, if you can, and who controls culture, or what a cultural field looks like in any society, in fact, is one indication of how healthy it is. And the more voices we have, the healthier, I think, a cultural field is. Now, it was in recognition of the dangers of controlling speech and thought. Okay, when Confucius was asked, he said, let me control speech and I'll control everything. And it was in recognition of the dangers of controlling speech and thought that the framers of the Constitution in the Bill of Rights, in fact, sought to guarantee freedom of speech and ultimately freedom of action. And there's a lot of talk about the First Amendment, and I think a lot of it actually is very misinterpreted. So it's actually worthwhile paying attention to what the First Amendment says, because I think NCTV actually is actually an instrument that could help democracy as the framers of the Constitution actually intended. This is what almost no one actually reads the First Amendment, so I'm actually going to read it to you. And you can actually see it's a really interesting document. Quote, this is what the First Amendment says. Quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Okay, let me break that down for you. In fact, when you look at the First Amendment, it's a really interesting theory of democracy and talks about the centrality of speech to it. Because in fact, there are 3 freedoms that are guaranteed by the First Amendment. It says the first one is Congress shall make no law. So government shall not interfere in. People can believe what they want to believe. And initially at that time it was freedom of religion, but no one can stop you from believing what you believe. No government can come down and say you can't believe that. Secondly, no one can stop you expressing what you believe. No one can stop you expressing what you believe. And then thirdly, there is the freedom of, it says, the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And I think the theory of democracy that's in the First Amendment says, okay, everyone can believe what they want to believe, but if everyone acts on that belief, you will have anarchy. And therefore, there has to be an instrument whereby a community actually talks and debates and tries to figure out what is consensus so you can move to action. And before you can go from everyone believing what they want to believe to some kind of community action, you have to have speech and discussion. And the presumption is that as you talk, as you debate, in fact, those ideas which are marginal will go off to the side. And in fact, in debate, people will change their minds. And you will be able to go from the anarchy of individual thought to, in fact, collective action in some kind of democratic way. And central to that is free speech. And then they realized at that time that also had to be extended, not just to individuals being able to speak, but also to the free press. It's a very interesting theory of democracy. It's a very, very interesting theory of democracy, and shows the centrality of media. That democracy is not just voting once every 4 years, and most people don't do that, but democracy is also about the conditions within which people think about their world. Now, when the Bill of Rights was first written, it was thought that only government was an enemy of freedom. Well, in the meantime, another source of concentrated power has arisen in the country, and that is corporate power. and corporate power, and they took they took Confucius's advice to heart. And they set about controlling the rectification of the language. They set about making sure that, in fact, the conditions of democracy would not be met. They did this in two ways. I mean, that's what the problem with the First Amendment in that present age is, that first preamble, Congress shall make no law. Well, that's not the only danger to freedom. That is not the only place where there can be some attacks on freedom. Nowadays, I mean, it was really talking about concentrated power. And now we now have to think about, in our present conditions, what are those organizations, what are those institutions that in fact prevent freedom of speech as it was laid out. Corporations did it in two ways. As I said, I wish more people would learn the lesson of Confucius, or would at least pay attention to what Confucius was saying about the centrality of culture, the centrality of storytelling. And corporations did it in two ways. Firstly, they did it by bringing as many media outlets as they could under their ownership, under private ownership, so that they would actually control the rectification of the language. So that today, in fact, only a handful of private companies own most of the media outlets, not just in the country, but in the world. So that's the first way. You control through ownership. The second way they did it was by the way in which you organize a media system. And the way they did it was say, we're going to organize a media system by essentially selling the attention of audiences to advertisers. And in fact, it's advertising that funds the system. If you don't believe me, just look at where the money comes from for commercial television, almost 100% from advertisers. For newspapers, it's about 80%. For magazines, it's anywhere from 50 to 80%. In fact, what we pay, what you pay to Comcast and what you pay to newspapers is a fraction of where the money from media comes in. It is advertisers who are buying our attention, who are the real customers of media. It shouldn't be surprising then that the media content we see across the whole range of the channels, media content we see, reflects the interests of those who own the media and those who are the major customers of media, which is advertisers. Okay, if you want to understand why television looks the way it does, there's a very, very simple explanation for it. The public, us, we are, and it's actually, I mean, it's our attention that is being sold. We are simply the product that is sold by the media industry. We're the commodity that is sold by the media industry. And we actually don't have a lot of say within it. The condition I've just described, that narrow concentration by corporate and commercial voices, is unhealthy for democracy. In fact, it works against democracy. And I think especially at a time when the means of production have become substantially cheaper and more accessible to people. In fact, it's much easier and much cheaper than it's ever been to be able to make, for example, a TV program or to make a film. The technology has come down in price, with a digital camera and, a Mac system, Final Cut Pro or whatever. I mean, for a few $1,000s, you actually have the instruments in your hands to be able to make material that looks as good at what it once used to cost $100,000, $200,000 to make. So I think the means of production, in fact, have become substantially democratized. They become more cheap, they become cheaper and more accessible to people. Unfortunately, this is the flip side of that, unfortunately, there has not been a similar development in the means of distribution. That is, once you produce something, who is going to see it? Where will it be shown? Which is still very narrowly controlled by corporate and commercial voices, except for the place we're in right now. In fact, I think one of the few places in the culture that offers some reason for optimism is in the area of cable access channels, which potentially, and I say potentially, offer local communities a way to give non-corporate, non-commercial voices an access to the living room. There's actually not many places where, not many instruments that exist that actually have that potentiality. And I think actually many more communities across the country should follow the leads of towns like Amherst and cities like Northampton and demand that in return for monopoly access to the homes of their citizens, which is what Comcast has, that in return for that monopoly, companies like Comcast have to give something back to the community, like a TV studio, like a couple of channels where programs can be shown. In fact, I'm really glad to see NCTV developing in the way it has done. I've been in the Valley for about 22 years or so. And I always said, why does Amherst have this great, this great organization, NCTV, and Northampton doesn't? And the reason we didn't have it was people hadn't got organized enough around the resources that in fact are available. And so I'm delighted to see the formation of NCTV. And again, I think Bill Dwight needs